Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a royal feast, a bloody battle, or a scandalous court affair, but with something much more intimate, much more universal, and, let's be honest, much smellier. We are diving nose first into the pungent, perplexing world of medieval hygiene. A time when people feared bathing more than the plague, when garlic was an acceptable perfume, and when your neighbour might quite literally dump unpleasant surprises out the window and call it civic participation. So, before you get comfortable, and trust me, you're about to feel very grateful for your modern shower, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, and whether you've just finished a hot bath, because after this you'll be extra thankful. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Not because of the medieval stench, though you might imagine it soon enough. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. First, let's tackle a common myth. That medieval people didn't care about hygiene and simply wallowed in filth for fun. Not true. They cared. They just had a very different idea of what clean meant, and even more fascinating of what was safe. Because cleanliness may be next to godliness today, but in 14th century Europe it was next to sickness, sin, and possibly social ruin. In the early Middle Ages, bathing was actually seen as a good thing. Monks had bathhouses. Some Roman habits of soaking and scrubbing still lingered in parts of Europe. The bathhouse was once a place of health and community, like a medieval spa day, minus the scented candles and cucumber slices. But then came a curious shift. By the late medieval period, water itself became suspect. Hot water? Downright treacherous. The thinking went like this. Hot water opened the pores, and open pores let disease seep in. Imagine going for a nice bath during a plague outbreak and emerging thinking you just turned yourself into a sponge for death. That was the genuine medieval fear. Add to that the church's increasing suspicion of nakedness, especially nakedness around other people, and suddenly the idea of a bath transformed from healthy to sinful, suspicious, and possibly fatal. Of course, they didn't abandon hygiene entirely. They just developed an impressive array of workarounds, from sponge baths to vinegar wipes, from linen undershirts to pomanders dangling like medieval air fresheners. We'll get to all of them, in excruciating and occasionally hilarious detail. So tonight, we'll peel back the sweaty layers of medieval life, quite literally, and see how people of the Middle Ages cleaned themselves, or at least pretended to, in a world without soap as we know it, without plumbing, and without the modern concept of deodorant. Spoiler alert, you wouldn't have lasted a single day. Let's begin with a surprise. In the early medieval centuries, bathing was not only accepted, it was encouraged. Monasteries had bathhouses, wealthy estates featured private tubs, even common townsfolk could occasionally soak in communal stews. The idea that the Middle Ages were a festival of filth right from the start is a modern myth. In fact, for a time, Europe still carried the soapy echoes of Roman cleanliness. People genuinely believed in the restorative powers of a good soak. And then, things got weird. The culprit. A mix of bad science, worse theology, and spectacular superstition. Somewhere between the 12th and 14th centuries, the winds shifted. Physicians of the day began to promote a delightful medical theory. That bathing in hot water opened the pores of the body, and open pores were practically an invitation to every plague, miasma, and evil spirit floating around town. Imagine emerging from your bath feeling refreshed, only to be told by your local doctor that you had essentially turned yourself into a sponge for death. Comforting, isn't it? Add to this a growing moral panic. Public bathhouses, once bustling centres of hygiene and community, began to acquire a reputation for extracurricular activities. Let's just say that for certain bathhouses, soap and water weren't the main attractions anymore. Mixed bathing, laughter, naked elbows. The church authorities clutched their rosaries in horror. Soon, bathhouses were condemned not only as health hazards, but also as dens of sin. It didn't help that the Black Death arrived to seal the deal, quite literally. When plague swept through Europe in waves during the 14th century, bathhouses were shut down en masse. Public health authorities of the time, in their infinite wisdom, reasoned, if bathhouses are places where people gather and bathe and people are dying after being near each other, obviously, the baths must be causing it. Thus, soaking oneself in warm water was rebranded from an act of health to an act of reckless self-endangerment. A bath, in this economy, in this plague-ridden air? Madness! Better to stay dry, stay dressed, and let your layers of linen do the heavy lifting, both figuratively and literally. Now, did people completely stop washing? Not exactly, but full-body bathing became rare, reserved for the very rich, the very brave, or the hopelessly itchy. Instead, partial washing and linen-based strategies took centre stage, but we'll get to those shortly. For now, picture this. A world where the majority of people, from bustling merchants to humble peasants, looked at a steaming bath not with longing, but with sheer terror, where opening one's pores was a death wish, and a tub of warm water was a trap set by the devil himself. In short, medieval Europe came to believe that it was cleaner to stay dirty, and that, dear listener, is the kind of logic that ensured you wouldn't last a single day. Before bathhouses became synonymous with scandal and disease, they were in fact the pride of many a medieval town. Imagine a time before plumbing, before private bathrooms, before anything resembling modern hygiene. Now imagine a place where, for a few coins, you could enjoy hot water, a clean towel, and the rare pleasure of not smelling like livestock. That, dear listener, was the medieval bathhouse at its finest. Bathhouses in early medieval Europe were inspired by lingering Roman traditions. The Romans, of course, had perfected the art of communal bathing. Vast complexes with hot, warm and cold pools, steam rooms and social spaces. After the fall of the Roman Empire, many of these bathhouses fell into ruin, but the idea stuck around. In certain corners of Europe, particularly in Italy, southern France and parts of Germany, new bathhouses were built, often modest but functional. By the 11th and 12th centuries, many towns had at least one public bathhouse. And these weren't gloomy holes in the wall. They were lively, bustling places where people from all walks of life could gather, scrub, steam, and, crucially, gossip. A medieval spa day, if you will. Imagine monks chatting about scripture while soaking, merchants striking deals between steam sessions, young nobles flirting behind clouds of rosemary-scented vapour. It was all very wholesome. Well, mostly wholesome. You'd enter the bathhouse and be greeted by the hum of voices, the hiss of steam, and the unmistakable aroma of herbs, sweat and ambition. After undressing, modestly or not, you'd proceed through a series of chambers, a warm room to acclimatise, a hot room for soaking or steaming, and a cold plunge pool to finish. Some bathhouses even offered massages, using oils infused with sage or lavender. A far cry from the popular image of the Middle Ages as an unwashed cesspool. And let's be honest, in an era where your home likely had no running water, and heating a tub at home meant hauling endless buckets from a well, the bathhouse was a godsend. For a modest fee you could be clean, socialise and catch up on the latest town scandals, all in one trip. And unlike modern spas, there were no strict etiquette rules about whispering. In fact, bathhouses were often downright noisy. Even the church initially approved. Monks were often among the cleanest members of society. Many monastic orders included scheduled bathing, and some monasteries had their own well-maintained bathhouses. The idea that cleanliness is next to godliness may not have been a medieval phrase, but for a time it was a practical reality. Of course, with popularity comes, well, complications. The bathhouse's reputation began to shift, but at this stage of history it remained a valued part of town life. For a fleeting golden age, Europeans embraced the notion that being clean was both healthy and fashionable. You could soak your troubles away, sweat out your sins, and emerge refreshed, both in body and in social standing. It was, in short, one of the few public places where you could leave smelling better than when you arrived, and that alone made it a medieval miracle. But alas, as with so many bright ideas in history, the medieval bathhouse soared too close to the sun, or perhaps too close to human nature, for as much as people loved to gather, soak and steam, they loved to push the boundaries even more. And soon enough, what began as a humble temple of hygiene began to pick up a distinctly saucy reputation. By the 13th century, things in many bathhouses had gotten steamy, and not just from the hot water. Bathhouses had evolved from places where one might rinse away the grime of daily life into places where one might, shall we say, pursue other forms of entertainment. Mixed bathing became common in certain regions. Now, while this may sound delightfully progressive, it quickly spiraled into a murky swirl of social flirtation and moral panic. Picture this. A respectable merchant arrives for a bath. He's expecting hot water, a bit of rosemary-scented steam, perhaps a friendly chat with fellow bathers. Instead, he finds himself seated next to the town's most notorious flirt, while half the bath attendants appear to have misplaced their linen shifts entirely. And suddenly, what was meant to be a cleansing ritual starts to feel like the prelude to a medieval soap opera. Naturally, the church began to take notice. Clerics, always attuned to the risk of mortal sin, and perhaps a bit jealous of all the fun, began to denounce the bathhouse as a breeding ground for immorality. Naked elbows? Scandalous. Shared tubs? Positively heretical. And the rumours only grew. Gossip spread faster than lice. Did you hear? Lady so-and-so was seen at the baths with her husband's apprentice. As bathhouses became synonymous with sin, their social standing declined. But if that weren't enough, another spectre loomed on the horizon: plague. When the Black Death arrived in the 14th century, Europeans were desperate for any explanation, and as medical theories of the time posited that disease entered through open pores, what better villain than the humble bathhouse? After all, where else did people willingly open their pores, surround themselves with strangers, and stew in questionable waters? The conclusion was inevitable. Bathhouses were shuttered, boards were nailed across doors, public notices were posted warning of the dangers of communal bathing. In some towns, bathhouses were literally torn down, their stones repurposed for church walls. A poetic bit of irony, really, from spa to sin to sanctuary. But it wasn't just health fears or church decrees that doomed the bathhouse, it was suspicion. The very idea of voluntarily getting wet, in public no less, now seemed absurdly dangerous. If you valued your life, your soul, or your social reputation, you stayed dry. Better to stink in safety than scrub in sin. And thus, within a few short decades, the bathhouse went from a civic treasure to a cultural pariah. The tubs were emptied, the steam faded, and the townsfolk resigned themselves to a new hygiene philosophy. If you can't smell yourself, you're probably fine. Of course, nothing accelerates a public moral panic quite like a good old-fashioned plague, and in the 14th century Europe was blessed, or perhaps cursed, with one of the worst plagues in recorded history, the Black Death. When the first cases appeared in the early 1340s, no one understood germs, bacteria, or even the basic concept of infection. But they understood fear, and they understood that sick people had to be avoided at all costs. Now put yourself in the sandals of a medieval citizen. You've heard that the plague is spreading. You've seen your neighbours drop like flies. You're not sure why, but everyone says it's something in the air. You're told to burn herbs, to carry up Amanda, to avoid bad smells, because clearly disease travels by odour. And then you remember the bathhouse, a place full of steam, humidity, open pores, and, worst of all, other people. Enter the perfect scapegoat. Medieval physicians, relying on the finest theories of bodily humours and miasma, were quick to warn that hot water opened the pores, allowing plague to seep in. The bathhouse, once a symbol of civic pride, was now viewed as a portal to pestilence. Never mind that rats, fleas and bacteria were the real culprits. In the medieval mind, it was the tub that would kill you. Municipal leaders wasted no time. Public bathhouses were closed for the good of the town. Notices were nailed to their doors. In some cities, bathhouses were boarded up overnight. Others were repurposed into storehouses, bakeries, or even plague hospitals. An ironic twist, given that no one wanted to be anywhere near a place associated with disease. And let's not forget the church. Ever vigilant for sin, the clergy seized the opportunity. See, we told you that bathing was dangerous, and now here is proof. The wrath of God is upon us. Suddenly to bathe was not only foolish, it was borderline blasphemous. Better to stink like a saint than to risk damnation by scrubbing. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Some die-hard bathers, the rebels of their time, clung to their soap and their tubs. Wealthier citizens still bathed in private, behind closed doors, with windows shuttered and servants sworn to secrecy. After all, what was the point of surviving the plague if you couldn't do it smelling faintly of lavender? But for the average person, the message was clear. Stay dry, stay alive. And so, in the shadow of the Black Death, the bathhouse culture that had flourished for centuries collapsed almost overnight. What had once been a place of community and cleanliness became a forbidden zone, a haunted relic of a more optimistic age. In time, many bathhouses were torn down, the stones were reused, the wooden tubs rotted away, and the very idea of communal bathing faded from memory. It would take centuries, and several revolutions in medical science, for Europeans to once again embrace the notion that water could be your friend, and not an accomplice of death himself. In the meantime, well, let's just say that for the next few hundred years, Europe wasn't winning any awards for scent. Now, while the common folk were busy convincing themselves that bathing was a one-way ticket to the grave, the upper crust of medieval society, ever fond of doing exactly what they weren't supposed to, found ways to keep the bubbles alive. Let's not be naive. If you were rich, titled, or possessed of an ego larger than your estate, the thought of forgoing baths entirely was absurd. What was the point of owning 15 embroidered linen shifts and a gilded comb if you couldn't strut about smelling faintly of rosemary instead of raw goat? And so, while public bathhouses shuttered and peasants aired out their armpits in prayer, the nobility simply moved the spa experience indoors. Picture this: a grand hall, tapestries fluttering, a fireplace roaring. Into this scene trundle servants carrying buckets, dozens of them, filled with boiling water. No plumbing, remember, no taps. Just an unending parade of sweating footmen and cursing scullions, all to fill one oversized wooden tub lined with a linen sheet to protect delicate, noble skin from splinters and the indignity of touching raw wood. Because naturally, if you were going to risk opening your pores, you were going to do it in style. Herbs were added, of course. Lavender, sage, marjoram, or frankly whatever the herbalist hadn't sold to the apothecary that morning. This wasn't so much a bath as a human soup. And yes, the noble in question would often emerge smelling like a cross between a spice merchant and a particularly determined salad. Privacy was negotiable. If you were of high enough rank, you might bathe alone, or with a favoured companion. Many noble couples treated bathing as a romantic pastime, because nothing says I love you quite like sitting in a tub of shared body grime, occasionally dodging floating bits of wilted herb. And of course, the servants were always there, discreetly present but absorbing every scandalous glimpse for later tavern gossip. After all, when your entire career revolves around pouring bath water and laundering tunics, you need some entertainment. Did nobles bathe often? Let's not get carried away. This was no daily ritual. A bath might happen once a month, once a season, or before an important feast. In between, linen layers did the heavy lifting. We'll get to those marvels soon. But when nobles did bathe, they made a spectacle of it. You can imagine the scene. The lord of the manor reclining in his steaming tub, issuing decrees while his steward tries to avoid breathing in too deeply. The lady of the house receiving guests from her tub because apparently "come in, I'm soaking" was perfectly acceptable in certain circles. and the occasional bard composing an ode to the delightful aroma of rosemary-infused nobility. Of course, not all was bliss. Heating enough water took hours. The firewood bill for a single bath could bankrupt a small village, and by the time the tub was full, the first buckets were already cooling. The result? Lukewarm luxury at best, tepid disappointment at worst. But still, for the medieval elite, bathing remained a privilege, a status symbol, and an opportunity to remind everyone just how far removed they were from the unwashed masses. And frankly, if you're going to risk catching the plague through your pores, you might as well do it surrounded by velvet curtains and singing minstrels. Now, while the nobility was reclining in linen-lined tubs sprinkled with expensive herbs and serenaded by slightly bored minstrels, the average medieval peasant was having an entirely different bathing experience, or more accurately, an entirely different relationship with water. You see, if you were poor, your hygiene options were somewhat limited. Your local bathhouse, if it had survived the last plague wave or ecclesiastical crackdown, was either boarded up or firmly out of your financial reach, and you certainly didn't have an army of servants to lug cauldrons of water up 3 flights of stairs. No, for you, bathing was a matter of improvisation, opportunity, and weather. Let's begin with rivers. If you lived near one that wasn't too polluted, a tall order, you might venture down for a communal scrub. Of course, this was a public event. Bathing alone was a luxury. More often, entire families, sometimes entire villages, would descend on the riverbank on a warm day, armed with soapwort, rough cloths, and a resigned attitude. Picture it. Children shrieking, dogs shaking themselves dry, women beating laundry against the rocks, and somewhere in the middle of it all you, trying to discreetly rinse yourself while avoiding fish, eels, and gossip. Privacy, forget it. Modesty, a distant dream. You might manage to bathe in your linen shift, but everyone knew exactly what was happening under that semi-transparent fabric. And heaven help you if you slipped and floated downstream. You'd be the talk of the village for weeks. Then there were the barrel baths. In the absence of a friendly river or cooperative weather, peasants sometimes resorted to large barrels, wooden tubs, or even repurposed wash tubs. These weren't glamorous. Picture a barrel half filled with lukewarm water, tucked into the corner of a smoky one-room cottage, surrounded by curious chickens and a cat glaring at you with contempt. And of course, this wasn't one bath per person. Water was a precious commodity. Heating it took time, wood, and patience. 3 things in short supply. So the bathing order was simple. Elders first, children last, and everyone else in between. By the time the youngest child had their turn, the water bore a closer resemblance to medieval stew than to anything remotely hygienic. Hence the famous phrase, "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater." And after seeing that water, you'd understand why someone might mistake it for waste. In winter, bathing was a bold act of masochism. Heating enough water to fill even a barrel was a monumental task. And stripping down in an unheated cottage was an invitation to pneumonia. Most peasants opted for strategic sponge baths, which we'll explore in detail soon, or simply resigned themselves to seasonal filth. If your neighbours were doing the same, no one noticed. After all, communal odour was the great social equaliser. And let's not forget the occasional festival bath. Before important feast days, weddings, or church events, peasants might make a concerted effort to scrub themselves, their clothes, and their children. And if time allowed, even the family goat. Multitasking was key. There are recorded instances of people bathing livestock and toddlers simultaneously. Efficiency first, hygiene second. So no, the poor didn't bathe often, but they also didn't wallow in filth out of sheer laziness. They were simply practical. When survival demanded 12 hours of labour in the fields, a bit of sweat was the least of your worries. And if your neighbours smelled the same as you, well, life went on. In short, for the medieval poor, bathing was a rare treat, a communal event, and a logistical nightmare. But when it did happen, when the river sparkled under the summer sun, and the gossip was flowing as freely as the water, There was a certain rough charm to the whole affair. Just don't ask what was floating downstream. Now, if bathing during the pleasant days of spring or summer was a challenge of logistics and courage, bathing in winter was a quest worthy of a ballad, preferably one sung while huddled under 14 layers of wool. You see, medieval winters were not exactly spa season. Imagine this. It's late December. Your cottage walls are little more than glorified planks. The wind whistles through every gap. The hearth fire is valiantly attempting to warm a single square foot of floor. And someone, probably your most optimistic relative, suggests heating water for a bath. Madness. Absolute madness. First, there's the wood problem. Firewood in winter was a scarce commodity, painstakingly gathered and fiercely rationed. Every log burned for bath water was a log not burned to keep your toes attached to your body. Heating enough water for even a half-hearted sponge bath meant committing to hours of fuel and labour. And remember, water freezes. By the time your servant, or more likely you, hauled it in from the well or river, it was already half slush. But suppose, against all odds, you managed to heat a few buckets. What then? You still had to strip down. And herein lay the true horror of winter bathing, nudity in medieval architecture. Picture standing stark naked in a room where your own breath forms icicles. The floor is stone, the draught is relentless, the chickens are staring, every inch of your body is screaming, this was a mistake. Hence, most people in winter embraced a simple and time-honoured strategy. Don't bathe, pretend you're clean. This wasn't sloth, it was survival. Medieval folks were fully aware of their limited options and simply adjusted their expectations. If your linen underlayer wasn't visibly crawling and your neighbours didn't physically recoil, you were doing just fine. Instead of full baths, winter hygiene centred on targeted cleaning. Face, hands, armpits and feet, the high traffic zones, could be managed with a cloth dipped in warm water and vinegar. A sort of medieval wet wipe, if you will. This method allowed you to stay modestly layered while achieving a semblance of cleanliness. And if the cloth froze mid-wipe, well, that was just part of the adventure. As for hair, washing it in winter was considered sheer lunacy. Wet hair meant instant frostbite, and no one wanted to explain to Father Anselm why they'd arrived at Mass with icicles hanging from their braids. Combing sufficed. In fact, winter was prime season for meticulous combing, partly to manage lice and partly because it was one of the few grooming rituals that didn't risk hypothermia. And what of the great unmentionable? The body odour? Everyone smelled. When no one bathed, communal tolerance skyrocketed. If your cottage smelled like damp wool, smoke and garlic, congratulations. So did everyone else's. Besides, strong smells were believed to ward off illness. A well-aged peasant might proudly claim that his aromatic aura was keeping the plague at bay. There were, of course, exceptions. In monasteries, where routine trumped comfort, some monks still performed ritual washing, teeth chattering all the while. Nobles, ever keen to flaunt their superiority, might endure a winter bath, but only in a well-stoked room and only with an audience of servants ready to refill the tub at the first sign of cooling. For the rest, dry cleaning, medieval style. So the next time you grumble about showering on a cold morning, just remember, your medieval counterpart faced the same dilemma, and usually chose stink and survive over scrub and perish. A perfectly reasonable choice, all things considered. Of course, medieval Europe was never a monolith. While the chilly towns of northern Europe embraced the stink and survive strategy with gusto, the sunny cities of southern Europe, those blessed with milder winters, stronger Roman influences, and frankly a higher tolerance for naked elbows, were not quite ready to give up their bathhouses. In places like Italy, southern France, and the Iberian Peninsula, public bathing never entirely fell out of fashion. The climate helped, of course. When your winter temperatures rarely dipped below mildly inconvenient, the logistics of heating water became far less daunting, and in regions where ancient Roman aqueducts still trickled along and old imperial bathhouses still stood in crumbling glory, the cultural memory of communal cleanliness remained stronger. Moreover, these areas often had better plumbing. Yes, plumbing, or at least a rough medieval approximation of it. Cities like Florence, Barcelona and Granada boasted stone channels and cisterns that made filling a bathhouse significantly easier than in some frostbitten northern hamlet, where hauling water meant chiselling it out of a frozen well. But beyond convenience, there was also a question of attitude. In southern Europe, attitudes toward public nudity and mixed bathing were generally more relaxed. The local clergy might wag a finger or deliver the occasional sermon about modesty, but when half the town was already soaking in scented water and swapping the latest political gossip, it was hard to enforce too strictly. And speaking of politics, many southern bathhouses were also centres of social life. Business deals were struck over steam, marriages were arranged between splashes, poets composed verses while reclining in hot pools. If you were a Florentine merchant or a Catalan noble, to not frequent the local bathhouse was to risk becoming socially invisible, and in the cutthroat world of medieval city-states, that simply wouldn't do. Of course, not all bathhouses were paragons of virtue. Some, shall we say, leaned into their reputations. There were certainly establishments in Venice and Seville where the line between spa day and scandal grew rather thin after sunset. But even so, the cultural expectation remained. You bathed regularly and in public. And while Northern Europe flinched at the thought of open pores, Southerners maintained a more pragmatic view. Many bathhouses in these regions incorporated steam rooms, cold plunges and herbal treatments specifically designed to bolster health and repel illness. Whether or not this actually worked is another matter, but the important thing is that they believed it did, and they smelled considerably better for their efforts. It's worth noting too that in cities with Muslim influence, such as those in Al-Andalus, the tradition of bathing remained even stronger. Hammams, modelled after Roman and Byzantine bathhouses, thrived in these regions, offering elaborate bathing rituals that combined cleanliness with social ritual. In these communities, bathing was not only acceptable, it was expected. So, while much of Europe recoiled from the bathhouse and embraced the comforting embrace of unwashed wool, there remain these sunlit pockets of resistance, places where the tub survived, the steam rose, and the citizens could hold their heads high, knowing that at the very least they weren't the ones making the streets smell like regret and goat. Now, while the average medieval person might have spent most of the year relying on strategic dabbing and communal denial, there were certain occasions when even the most stubborn peasant or proudly unwashed noble would reluctantly admit that a bit of scrubbing was in order. Enter the grand tradition of holiday hygiene. You see, in a world where full-body bathing was considered risky, indulgent, or downright sinful, it took a truly special occasion to justify breaking out the good soap and boiling that precious water. But thankfully, the medieval calendar was positively stuffed with feast days, holy days, market fairs, and life milestones that could be used as an excuse to temporarily abandon the dry and dusty philosophy. First and foremost on the list, Easter. Nothing said Christ is risen, quite like showing up to church with at least the visible parts of your body no longer encrusted in medieval living. In many villages it was customary, often encouraged by the local priest, to bathe before Easter Mass. Not necessarily because anyone thought it would save your soul, but because packing an unwashed congregation into a stone chapel for 6 hours of chanting was a recipe for divine nausea. Next came weddings. Whether you were the bride, the groom, or an unfortunate relative forced to marry off your third cousin for 3 goats and a sack of barley, there was one universal truth. You needed to be clean enough to stand near another human for the duration of the ceremony. Thus, pre-wedding baths were common. In fact, in some regions the bath itself was an important ritual. The bride might be scrubbed by her female relatives, accompanied by singing, gossip, and the occasional argument about who forgot the rosemary. The groom usually got tossed into a barrel and told not to drown. Another key moment for medieval hygiene, childbirth. After the baby was born, usually at home, surrounded by midwives, relatives, and various household livestock, both mother and child would be washed as part of the recovery and purification process. The mother might receive a sponge bath with warm water and herbs to promote healing, while the baby would be dipped in tepid water, occasionally with rosemary or chamomile. Because if nothing else, the medieval mindset was very consistent about herbs. And then, of course, there were plague recoveries, assuming you were among the lucky few to survive. If you managed to outlast the latest outbreak of death and pustules, it was customary to undergo a cleansing bath. Not necessarily for medical reasons, after all the local physicians still thought miasma was your biggest enemy, but because your loved ones were probably tired of both your smell and the lingering aura of near death. Nothing said, "Welcome back to the land of the living," like being gently simmered in a barrel of tepid herb-infused broth. Even beyond these major life events, many communities had smaller seasonal bathing traditions. In certain regions, it was common to bathe before major saints' days or before embarking on a pilgrimage. After all, if you were going to walk 500 miles to some distant shrine, you might as well start the journey only moderately offensive to the nose. It's worth noting, too, that in some places, lords and wealthy townsfolk would sponsor public baths on certain feast days, offering the rare opportunity for the poor to bathe for free. A gesture that was equal parts charity, civic pride, and self-preservation. If we must all crowd into the market square tomorrow, perhaps it would be best if half the village doesn't smell like fermented turnip. But even on these occasions, expectations were modest. No one was striving for modern standards of cleanliness. A good sponge bath, fresh linen, and a brief soak of the feet were enough to be considered presentable. After all, when your peers were measuring hygiene in terms of least offensive rather than minty fresh, the bar was comfortably low. So yes, the medieval world did have its moments of collective cleanliness. Not frequent, not consistent, but earnest in their own way. And while no amount of holiday bathing could erase the olfactory sins of the remaining 350 days, it did at least ensure that for a few precious occasions each year, the streets of medieval Europe smelled slightly less like garlic, goat, and existential despair. Now, since full-body bathing was now largely reserved for saints, sinners, and lunatics, the average medieval person relied heavily on what we might generously call the sponge bath of the era. Of course, actual sponges, those cheerful yellow things you buy in packs of 3, were not part of the medieval hygiene arsenal. If you were especially lucky and lived near the Mediterranean, you might get your hands on a real sea sponge. But for most Europeans, a sponge bath involved a linen cloth, a bowl of lukewarm water, and grim determination. Let's set the scene. You wake up. The weather is miserable. You smell, let's say, medieval. A full bath is out of the question. The bathhouse is shut, your barrel is frozen, and you've got chores to do before sunrise. Time for the pragmatic approach. First, you fetch a bit of water. If you're feeling fancy, you heat it a little, perhaps adding vinegar, rosemary, or a few drops of whatever passed for perfume in your household. More often than not, it's just plain water with the faint aroma of yesterday's cooking fire. Then comes the ritual of wiping. Hands first, because those are public-facing. Face next, because even in the Middle Ages no one wanted to look like they'd just fought a soot monster. Armpits followed, though here the effort often depended on personal standards, available herbs, and whether or not you were planning to see your betrothed that day. Feet might also get attention, especially if it was Sunday and you were due in church. Washing one's feet had both spiritual and practical significance, and after a week of trudging through mud, manure, and worse, it was practically an act of charity toward the congregation. As for the rest, well, that depended on your energy, social calendar, and level of shame. In many households, the guiding principle was simple. If it's covered in 3 layers of linen and wool, no one will know. This was the true medieval art of strategic cleaning, a delicate balance between effort and plausible deniability. But make no mistake, these sponge baths were not some kind of indulgent self-care ritual. There were no candles, no calming music, no artisan exfoliating cloths. The cloth was probably an old shirt, The water was tepid at best, and the entire affair was performed in the corner of a cold room, while trying to ignore the goat watching you with evident judgment. For the wealthy, of course, things were slightly more refined. Nobles might have attendants to heat the water, mix in rose water or herbs, and gently wipe them down. But even here, the emphasis was more on masking odour than on true cleanliness. A perfumed cloth could do wonders for social confidence, even if it did nothing for the underlying reality. Monks, ever the paragons of routine, took their sponge baths quite seriously. Many orders included regular washing of the face, hands and feet in their daily schedule, and since monks were generally cleaner than the average peasant or noble, it wasn't uncommon for them to quietly sniff their less devout brethren and think, someone has not been wiping properly. It's also worth noting that in many households, linen played a crucial role in this process. People wore undergarments specifically to absorb sweat and grime. Washing your linen shirt or shift was often more effective and socially acceptable than attempting a full bath. A fresh linen layer gave the illusion of cleanliness, even if the body beneath remained firmly medieval. In short, the medieval sponge bath was less about pampering and more about triage. You couldn't fight the stench entirely, but you could at least stay one step ahead of total aromatic collapse. And in a world where no one smelled like a meadow, being the person who smelled slightly less offensive was practically a social victory. So the next time you swipe a scented wipe across your brow after a workout, spare a thought for your medieval counterpart, standing barefoot on a drafty floor, clutching a damp cloth and thinking, good enough for mass. Now, if you happen to be born into nobility, congratulations. Your life was filled with tapestries, banquets, and absolutely no expectation that you would ever scrub your own armpits. Hygiene, like so many other burdens of medieval life, was something you could delegate. Enter the world of servants tasked with washing their masters and occasionally living to regret it. Let us begin with the basics. If a nobleman or noblewoman desired a bath, whether a full immersion or a strategic sponge job, they did not simply draw the water themselves. No, that was for the peasants. Instead, a small army of household staff was mobilised. First came the wood haulers, tasked with keeping the fires roaring for hours, then the water carriers, hauling countless buckets from well to hearth to chamber, and finally the attendants, who would test the water's temperature, arrange the linens, and pray silently that today's bath would not involve any unexpected drama. Once the bath was ready, typically a wooden tub lined with fresh linen, the noble would disrobe. Now, depending on the household, this might happen with a certain amount of privacy, or none at all. Some nobles, especially the more flamboyant variety, treated the event as a theatrical performance. After all, what was the point of having servants if they couldn't admire your heroic calves while you stepped into the tub? And thus the real work began. Servants would gently ladle water over their master or mistress, carefully avoiding splashes that might offend delicate sensibilities. Then came the linen cloths, soaked in warm, herb-infused water. The washing itself was highly choreographed, starting with the hands and arms, moving to the neck and shoulders, and progressing downward, though how far downward depended entirely on the lord's mood and the servant's courage. It was a delicate dance. Wash too vigorously and you risked bruising a duke's ego. Too timidly, and you might be accused of laziness or insolence. And should the noble decide mid-bath to issue commands, discuss estate finances, or wax poetic about the latest court scandal, the servant was expected to nod, smile, and continue scrubbing without missing a beat. Ladies of the nobility had their own rituals, equally elaborate and often conducted by female attendants. In some cases, this was a rare opportunity for gossip. Lady Eleanor's love life, the cook's new apprentice, the state of the bishop's socks, all discussed while lavender-scented cloths were applied to backs and shoulders. But woe betide the maid who dropped a cloth or, heaven forbid, snickered at an inopportune moment. Gossip was fine, embarrassment was not, and of course no bath was complete without hair care. Here the servants truly earned their keep. Detangling medieval hair was a Herculean task, especially when it had not seen a comb in several fortnights. Hair was washed sparingly. When it was, servants would pour vinegar or herbal infusions through the tresses, then comb them meticulously with bone or horn combs. One can only imagine the whispered curses behind those patient smiles. It must also be said, sometimes the noble's personal hygiene left much to be desired. A well-fed baron who had spent the summer hunting, feasting and rarely changing his doublet might present a challenge of epic proportions. There are records, politely worded of course, of servants fainting from the sheer potency of certain noble persons during the bath process. And yet the duty remained. Scrub, smile, survive. And when it was all over, the noble would be wrapped in fresh linen, anointed with oils or perfumes, and proclaimed fit for court, all thanks to the quiet, thankless labour of the very people who would never dream of such luxuries for themselves. So the next time you step into a hot shower with the mere flick of a wrist, spare a thought for those medieval servants, standing in a chilly chamber, cloth in hand, trying to wash a duke's armpit while pretending not to notice that he hadn't bathed since Michaelmas. Now, if there was one corner of medieval society where hygiene managed to cling to a modicum of dignity, it was inside the monasteries. The monks, ever obsessed with order, discipline, and the state of their immortal souls, also happened to be surprisingly attentive to the state of their mortal bodies, at least compared to the peasants outside the abbey walls. First, you must understand, medieval monks lived according to strict routines. The day was divided into carefully measured hours of prayer, work, study, and, yes, washing. Many monastic rules, such as those of the Rule of St. Benedict, explicitly required monks to wash their hands and faces regularly and to bathe their entire bodies as necessity demands, which in monk speak meant at least more than once per year. Compared to the surrounding villagers, who might bathe once a season or once per plague outbreak, the monks were practically modern hygiene influencers. Of course, we're not talking about daily showers with artisanal soaps and loofahs. The monks' approach was more pragmatic. Keep clean enough to avoid scandal, distraction, or the unbearable stench of your own brethren during Vespers. Monasteries often had their own bathhouses, modest affairs, nothing like the decadent public stews of the cities, but serviceable. A small stone chamber, a tub or two, a system for heating water. Baths might be scheduled 4 times a year, usually around the major liturgical seasons, before Easter, before Christmas, after the summer harvest, and before the feast of the monastery's patron saint. For monks in warmer climates, additional washing was permitted, provided it didn't encourage vanity. Daily hygiene centered on partial washing. Every morning, monks would rinse their hands, faces and feet, usually with water fetched by the younger novices, because if you can't exploit youthful enthusiasm in the service of cleanliness, what's the point of having novices? After labouring in the fields or working in the scriptorium, monks were expected to clean up again, not for themselves, but out of respect for the community. No one wanted Brother Gregory's turnip-scented sleeves wafting through the refectory. And then there was the matter of clothing. Monks were required to change their undergarments regularly, typically linen shirts and drawers. Some orders even specified that this was to be done weekly, an astonishing standard of hygiene in a time when most peasants wore the same tunic until it could practically stand up on its own. Monastic laundry days were major events. Imagine a cloister courtyard filled with fluttering habits and steaming cauldrons, while the brothers chanted psalms and tried not to grumble about soap rations. Speaking of soap, monks often made their own from lye, animal fat and herbs. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Monastic soap was used for both laundry and body washing, though always with due modesty. Full nudity was frowned upon. Bathers typically kept on a linen shift or bathed behind screens. After all, occasions of sin were to be avoided even in the bathhouse. Hair care was simpler. Monks were usually tonsured, meaning their heads were partially shaved, which made lice management considerably easier. Lice were an ever-present nuisance. even in monasteries, but regular combing and occasional head washing with vinegar or herbal rinses kept infestations to a respectable minimum. Now, lest you think monastic hygiene was entirely enlightened, remember, this was still medieval Europe. Some monks developed rather eccentric theories about cleanliness. There are charming records of certain abbots insisting that holy odour was a sign of spiritual asceticism, and that a particularly pungent monk was simply mortifying the flesh. This led to occasional disagreements in the cloister. Nothing divides a monastic community quite like the question of whether Brother Peter's 3-year bath hiatus was an act of piety or an act of war against communal noses. Still, by medieval standards, monks were the cleanest people in town. Visitors to monasteries often remarked on the fresh linen, orderly habits, and faint scent of lavender or rosemary that drifted through the cloisters, and while peasants scratched and nobles masked their musk with overpowering perfumes, the monks quietly maintained a level of hygiene that, while imperfect, made them the envy of many a visiting bishop. So the next time you light a lavender candle and run a hot bath, remember your medieval monastic forebears, scrubbing stoically by candlelight, wrapped in linen, chanting psalms, and hoping fervently that Brother Gregory had finally washed his feet. Now, if you've been wondering how medieval folks managed to maintain a thin veneer of respectability in an era when full-body bathing was rarer than a sober tavern at Harvest Festival, the answer lies in one humble but heroic item: linen underwear. That's right. When in doubt, change the linen, not the body. This was the unspoken mantra of medieval hygiene. A person might go weeks, even months, without a proper bath, but they would still do their utmost to keep their underlayers clean, and for good reason. Linen was breathable, absorbent, and far easier to wash than the human form, which was prone to superstition, sin, and shivering fits when exposed to water. Let us begin with the basics. The standard medieval undergarment was the linen shirt, known variously as a chemise, shift, or smock for women, and a shirt or camisa for men. For the lower half, men also wore linen brays, loose-fitting underpants that were often tied at the waist and sometimes at the knees, depending on how much chafing one was willing to tolerate. This layer of linen served multiple purposes. First and foremost, it absorbed sweat, body oils, and any other unmentionables produced by the daily toil of medieval life. This was crucial, because over it came woolen garments, tunics, gowns, hose, which were expensive, heavy, and exceedingly difficult to launder. You didn't wash your wool unless you wanted to end up with a garment 3 sizes smaller and smelling faintly of damp sheep for eternity. So instead, you relied on your trusty linen to take the brunt of the filth, and wash it they did. Linen laundering was one of the most common household chores, especially among women. The process was not for the faint of heart. It involved boiling water, lye soap, which could strip paint off a cart, vigorous scrubbing, and hours of rinsing and wringing. In some cases, urine, yes, aged fermented human urine, was used to help bleach stubborn stains. If you're cringing now, imagine how the washerwomen felt. They deserved canonization for their efforts. As for frequency, that depended on class, climate, and personal fastidiousness. Monks were often required to change their linen weekly, practically a spa schedule by medieval standards. Nobles might change every few days, especially if they were expecting company or court appearances. The poor aimed for once a fortnight, or when the linen began to crackle audibly when folded. Clean linen was also a powerful social signal. In a world where full baths were rare, turning up in white, freshly laundered undergarments was the medieval equivalent of stepping out of a designer boutique today. It said, "I may be marinating in my own natural perfume, but at least my shirt is crisp." In fact, chroniclers of the time often described a person's cleanliness by referencing their linen. He was a man of good character and spotless chemise. Quite literally. And yes, this extended to the bedroom. Linen nightshirts were common, and changing into fresh linen before going to bed was considered a mark of respectability and comfort. After all, If you were going to sleep 3 to a bed in a draughty stone chamber, you at least wanted to reduce the olfactory offences as much as possible. For women, the linen shift was even more indispensable. It not only protected expensive gowns from sweat, but also served as modest sleepwear and casual home attire. In certain circles, a well-embroidered shift might peek decorously from under a gown, offering a glimpse of both virtue and laundering diligence, because nothing said marriage material like a chemise that was whiter than snow, or at least whiter than the village goats. Now, let us not idealise. Changing and laundering linen was laborious, and many peasants simply didn't have multiple sets. For them, it was a grim rotation. Wear it until you couldn't stand the smell, wash it, pray for sun, and start again. In winter, drying linen could take days, often indoors where it hung from rafters, dripping over anyone foolish enough to walk underneath. Medieval children quickly learned that "don't stand under the shift" was both a practical warning and a family proverb. So in the grand hierarchy of medieval hygiene, linen was king. It was the first line of defence, the badge of cleanliness, the difference between presentable and pariah. And while it may not have stopped lice, plague, or the occasional judgmental sniff from your neighbours, it at least gave medieval folk the comforting illusion that beneath the grime and superstition, they were still civilised, one fresh shirt at a time. Now, while medieval folk might have viewed full-body bathing as a gateway to sin, sickness and soggy discomfort, when it came to their hair, they displayed a surprising amount of care, creativity, and the occasional misplaced optimism, contrary to the popular image of every medieval peasant wandering about with a matted bird's nest atop their head. Hair was, in fact, something people took pride in. A well-maintained head of hair could be a sign of virtue, beauty, or at the very least enough social awareness to avoid being mistaken for a forest hermit. Of course, the definition of well-maintained was a little different in a world where shampoo was non-existent and water was viewed with suspicion. For most, hair care started with combing, lots and lots of combing. Bone, horn, or wooden combs with fine teeth were a staple in households across Europe. They served 2 vital purposes: untangling hair, and more importantly removing lice and nits, those cheerful companions of nearly every medieval scalp. A typical morning routine involved sitting by the hearth for warmth and light, letting down the hair, which was often braided or bound tightly during the day, and combing thoroughly. This could take quite some time, especially for women with long hair, and heaven help the poor soul who skipped a few days and ended up trying to comb through a medieval dreadlock. In such cases, drastic measures were sometimes taken, including cutting off chunks of hair, followed by much weeping and a sudden surge in headscarf sales. As for washing, well, hair was washed sparingly, usually only a few times per season, or on special occasions. Weddings, religious festivals, or a sudden infestation so bad even the local priest raised an eyebrow. Washing one's hair was not something done lightly, as it required heating large amounts of water, preparing herbal rinses, and dedicating an entire afternoon to the task. What did they wash with? The adventurous used lye soap, though it was harsh and could leave the scalp feeling like it had been sandpapered by St. Peter himself. More common were egg yolks, which were believed to nourish and soften the hair, though they had the unfortunate side effect of making you smell like a slightly distressed omelette, if not rinsed properly. Another popular rinse was a mixture of vinegar and herbs, rosemary, lavender, sage, which helped cut through the grease and left a more pleasant aroma than, say, the local tanner's yard. And in certain regions, particularly where beer brewing was common, beer rinses were all the rage. They added shine, they said, though whether this was due to the malt or because you were too tipsy to notice your own reflection is still debated. Men typically kept their hair shorter, unless fashion dictated otherwise, looking at you 14th century courtly knights with your flowing locks. For them, combing was simpler, but the threat of lice was no less present. Many opted to wear caps or hoods, partly for warmth, partly to contain whatever was living in their hair. Pragmatism at its finest. Monks, of course, had an advantage: tonsure. Shaving the crown made lice management far easier, though even tonsured monks had to deal with the occasional monastic itch, leading to communal lice-combing sessions that were probably far livelier than the rule of St. Benedict strictly allowed. And then there were the noble ladies, for whom hair care was practically a competitive sport. A well-coiffed noblewoman could spend hours having her hair washed, scented, braided, and adorned with ribbons, veils, or even jewelled nets. Her attendants, who did the actual work, often emerged from these sessions looking as if they'd been wrestling a particularly irritable sheep. But the result? A cascade of gleaming, perfumed hair that might just distract from the fact that the wearer hadn't bathed fully since Michaelmas. Of course, despite all this effort, lice were inevitable. Everyone had them. Peasants, nobles, clergy. It was simply a question of degree and management. The goal wasn't to eliminate lice, an impossible dream, but to keep the population at socially acceptable levels. A clean scalp, like clean linen, was more about appearances than absolute success. So yes, medieval hair care was a curious blend of vanity, superstition, and stubborn resilience. People combed religiously, washed cautiously, and perfumed liberally, all in the hope of projecting an image of cleanliness and civility in a world where both were constantly under siege. And next time you reach for that bottle of conditioner promising silky softness and anti-frizz, just remember your medieval ancestors, sitting by the hearth, egg yolk dripping down their temples, wondering if this time, just this once, they might finally outsmart the lice. Now, if you think medieval hair care was a heroic battle against the forces of nature, wait until we step into the world of dental hygiene, or what passed for it when the cutting edge of dental science was, quite literally, a blade. Let's be clear. Medieval people did care about their teeth. They liked to chew, after all, and in a society built around bread, roasted meat, and suspiciously chewy vegetables, a functioning set of molars was practically a status symbol. But lacking modern dentistry, fluoridated water, or even the concept of oral bacteria, they had to get creative, and sometimes alarmingly inventive, about keeping their teeth at least partially attached to their gums. So, what did they do? First and foremost, rubbing and scrubbing. Toothbrushes as we know them did not exist. Instead, most people used linen rags wrapped around a finger, which they would dip in various abrasive substances, salt, charcoal, powdered herbs, or crushed eggshells. The goal was simple: scrub away visible gunk and ideally take a few layers of enamel with it for good measure. A gleaming smile? Maybe. A sensitive smile? Absolutely. For those who preferred a more tactile experience, chewing sticks were popular. Small twigs from trees like hazel, birch, or apple were chewed until one end became frayed, turning it into a primitive brush. You'd then scrub your teeth and gums with this natural bristled wonder, while probably wondering if it would double as a toothpick. Sustainability, medieval style. Mouth rinses were also common, though the recipes varied wildly. The wealthy might rinse with wine or vinegar, sometimes infused with mint, sage, or cloves. The poor made do with plain water or a swish of ale, which at least numbed the gums if not the dental guilt. And then there were the tooth powders. Oh yes. A good medieval tooth powder might include ground oyster shells, burnt rosemary, salt and myrrh. Some even added honey to make the mixture more palatable, though this somewhat defeated the purpose by inviting every passing plague-bearing fly into your mouth. But the theory was sound. Abrasion equals cleanliness. Never mind that it also equaled gradual tooth erosion. Now let us address the great unspoken question. Tooth decay. It happened, of course. Diets were generally low in refined sugar, which spared many peasants from the dental disasters of later centuries. But between gritty bread, unfiltered ale, and the occasional gnawed bone, teeth still suffered. And when they did, there was one solution: extraction. Enter the medieval barber surgeon, a man equally comfortable cutting hair, lancing boils, and yanking teeth. There were no dentists as a separate profession. If you had a toothache, you went to the barber, who would examine your jaw, nod sagely, and then proceed to yank the offending tooth out with iron pincers. No anesthesia, of course. Perhaps a slug of spiced wine if you were lucky, or a belt to bite if you were not. Pain management was for the weak, and aftercare, a rinse of salt water, a prayer to St. Apollonia, patron saint of dental sufferers, and the hope that the wound didn't become a gateway to fatal sepsis. Many a brave soul entered the barber's chair with a toothache and left without a tooth, and occasionally without their full supply of blood. Despite all this, medieval people valued a good smile. Chronicles mention white teeth as a sign of beauty, particularly for noble women. Courtly love poems praised the gleam of a lady's teeth almost as often as her eyes or hair. And while modern orthodontics was centuries away, the wealthy sometimes filed or polished their teeth for cosmetic effect, an act of both vanity and medieval dental roulette. In short, dental care in the Middle Ages was a world of enthusiastic effort, questionable methods, and ironclad resilience. People scrubbed, rinsed, chewed, and prayed, all in the hope of preserving their chewing power for another season of tough bread and tougher meat. So the next time you reach for your electric toothbrush and minty gel, give silent thanks, and perhaps a small nod to your medieval ancestors who faced the same battle with a rag, a twig, and a disturbing amount of powdered shellfish. Now, no matter how much linen you changed, how many vinegar cloths you applied, or how vigorously you scrubbed your teeth with burnt rosemary, there was one truth of medieval life you could not escape. Everything smelled. And not in a charming, freshly baked bread kind of way. No, the default medieval scent profile was wood smoke, sweat, livestock, garlic, mildew, and a lingering note of human despair. Add in the occasional plague pit or back alley tanner, and it's no wonder that medieval folks became experts in the fine art of covering the stench rather than eliminating it. Enter the heroic world of aromatization, a valiant, if doomed, effort to overlay the omnipresent musk of medieval existence with something at least vaguely floral or spicy. The go-to weapon of choice, the mighty pomander. For the uninitiated, a pomander was a small, often spherical container made of silver, gold, or carved wood, filled with strongly scented substances. These could include cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, dried rose petals, ambergris, musk, or civet, the latter two extracted from the nether regions of very confused animals. The entire concoction was designed to emit a powerful, pleasant odour, powerful enough, hopefully, to overpower the public cesspit 2 streets over. Pomanders were worn on chains or ribbons, tucked into pouches, or even hung from belts. For noble women, they became fashion accessories, part jewel, part olfactory survival kit. You might spend your morning wandering through a pungent fish market, but with a well-stuffed pomander dangling from your waist, you could at least pretend to be breathing in a Tuscan garden. And the creativity didn't stop there. Ladies frequently tucked scented sachets, filled with dried herbs or flowers, into their bodices, sleeves, or hair. The result was a heady mix of personal perfume and medieval Febreze, wafting gently and often desperately through the air. Rosemary and lavender were popular, as was sage, not just for its pleasant scent, but because it was thought to ward off disease. Speaking of disease, let's not forget that aromatization wasn't purely cosmetic. Medieval folk genuinely believed that bad smells caused illness, the infamous miasma theory, hence the popularity of herbal prophylaxis. Carrying a pomander or wearing garlands of garlic wasn't just about not offending the bishop. It was seen as a literal shield against the plague. And while modern science might raise an eyebrow, it must be said, standing next to a heavily perfumed noble probably was marginally safer than standing next to an unwashed fishmonger in August. Men too joined the aromatic arms race. Wealthy merchants and courtiers often dabbed their linen cuffs and collars with scented oils, civet, rosewater, or imported attar, ensuring that at least the parts of them closest to other people's noses smelled presentable. And when entering crowded spaces, courts, banquets, or packed chapels during Lent, it was common to hold a scented handkerchief to one's face, both to ward off illness and to avoid gagging on the communal stench. Of course, not everyone could afford such luxuries. The common folk made do with herbs. Bundles of rosemary, thyme, or marjoram hung from beams, tucked into clothing chests, or strewn across rush-strewn floors. A freshly scattered floor of herbs and rushes could buy you a few days of semi-tolerable air, until the rushes inevitably turned into a matted swamp of filth and mouse droppings, at which point you simply added more herbs on top and hoped for the best, layering medieval addition. And then there were the truly desperate measures. Some folk burned incense or aromatic resins indoors, though this often led to sooty walls and blackened lungs. Others doused themselves in vinegar, believing the sharp scent would drive away both fleas and plague. One enterprising chronicler even records a knight of Aquitaine who, during a particularly bad summer, resorted to dousing his armour with rosewater, an admirable effort that reportedly left him smelling like a floral abattoir after the first battle. In short, medieval aromatization was a never-ending, often futile struggle, a fragrant arms race against the inevitable entropy of medieval life. Yet in this battle of clove versus corpse stench, herb versus human musk, our ancestors fought bravely, armed with pomanders, sachets, and enough cinnamon and rose oil to bankrupt a modern perfumery. So the next time you spritz on a bit of eau de cologne before heading out, remember, you're continuing a proud tradition, one that stretches back to a time when the choice wasn't between citrus or sandalwood, but between smelling like a spring, meadow or smelling like you just crawled out of a medieval latrine. Now, in an age without roll-on sprays or cleverly marketed clinical strength formulas, you might well wonder, how did medieval folks tackle body odour? The short answer, with a combination of optimism, denial, and a great deal of herb-based improvisation. It's worth noting that the concept of natural body scent was rather more generously defined in the Middle Ages. Everyone smelled, nobles, peasants, monks, kings, and the communal stench of society was simply part of the human experience. In a way, it fostered unity. You might despise your neighbour, but at least you both smelled like you'd ridden through a garlic field after chasing pigs. That said, people were not entirely indifferent. They did attempt to manage body odour, just not by preventing sweat, which was seen as healthy. According to the medical wisdom of the day, sweating was the body's way of expelling bad humours. To block it was not only foolish, but potentially deadly. The goal, therefore, was not to stop perspiration, but to mask the consequences. The simplest method? Herbal powders. One common recipe involved ground sage, rosemary, lavender, mint and dried rose petals, often mixed with alum powder, a naturally occurring mineral salt known for its mild antibacterial properties. This powder was patted under the arms, on the chest and sometimes around the neck, creating a protective scented shield, or at least a polite distraction. And alum itself was something of a medieval marvel. It didn't stop sweat, but it did reduce odour-causing bacteria, meaning that in some ways it was the earliest form of deodorant. If you were lucky enough to afford a chunk of imported alum, you could rub it directly onto your skin after washing, assuming, of course, that you had washed that month. For the less wealthy, options were more rustic. Crushed herbs and flowers were sewn into linen pouches worn under the arms or in the bodice. Cloves, nutmeg, marjoram, chamomile, all popular choices. And if herbs weren't available, there was always the fallback, vinegar washes. A quick wipe with vinegar-soaked cloths helped neutralise odour, though it left you smelling somewhat like a particularly assertive salad. Still, it was preferable to the alternative. Of course, fashion also played a role in managing armpit affairs. Loose-fitting garments and layers of linen underclothes absorbed sweat before it could saturate expensive outerwear. Changing your linen shirt regularly, perhaps even twice a week if you were positively decadent, was considered the pinnacle of personal hygiene. If you smelled faintly of lavender and fresh linen, it was a social victory regardless of what was happening beneath the surface. And then there were the perfume enthusiasts. The wealthy might dab rosewater, orange blossom water, or civet-infused oils onto pulse points, neck, wrists, and yes, even underarms. The result was a heady mix of floral notes over a base of human reality. But again, it was the effort that counted. In medieval society, trying to smell nice was often more socially rewarding than actually achieving it. Some took more extreme measures. Certain court manuals suggest applying powdered orris root, the dried root of the iris plant, as a natural deodorizer. Others recommended bathing the armpits in wine, which certainly made for interesting company at feasts if not entirely effective. And when all else failed, one simply embraced the musk. After all, in a world where the local lords smelled no better than the stable boy, and where plague doctors walked about in beaked masks stuffed with herbs, olfactory offences were equal opportunity hazards. Indeed, there's a certain charm in knowing that while we fret today over 24-hour protection and fresh spring breeze scents, our medieval ancestors tackle the same challenges armed with sage, vinegar and sheer stubbornness. So the next time you reach for your favourite deodorant, take a moment to appreciate the long, fragrant and occasionally vinegary journey of human ingenuity. And remember, you could be dabbing mint leaves under your arms and praying that St. Apollonia intercedes on your behalf at tomorrow's market fair. Now, if you think modern folk have it rough with a touch of dandruff or the occasional lice outbreak at school, spare a thought, and perhaps a sympathetic scratch, for your medieval ancestors, for whom itchiness was practically a lifestyle. Let's begin with the undisputed monarch of medieval scalp discomfort. Lice. Head lice were as inevitable as taxes and bad weather. They did not discriminate. Peasants, nobles, monks, merchants, all were equally delicious to these tiny parasites. Entire villages might be crawling communities, with the lice population rivaling that of the human one. And yet, lice were not particularly scandalous. In fact, they were a simple fact of life. Chronicles from the period mention lice in court poetry, love letters, and even religious texts. If anything, having lice was proof that you were alive. Barely, but alive. The question was not if you had them, but how badly. So what did people do about it? The primary weapon was the lice comb, a small fine-toothed tool made from bone, wood or horn. Every household had one. The daily routine often included sitting by the hearth while a family member or servant carefully combed through your hair, removing both adult lice and their stubborn little eggs, nits. The process could take hours, and while it wasn't exactly relaxing, it did offer an opportunity for gossip, flirtation and theological debate. For those who could not afford such luxuries, or for monks with tonsured scalps, the solution was often more extreme, shaving the head entirely. This had the added benefit of keeping lice off the scalp, though it did little to stop them from colonising beards, eyebrows and other strategic locations. Indeed, lice were impressively adaptable, moving from one warm, hairy ecosystem to another with the confidence of a seasoned pilgrim. And lest you think this was limited to the head, oh no, body lice were rampant, especially given that medieval folk often wore the same linen shirt for weeks. These lice lived in clothing seams and emerged to feed, a delightful nocturnal surprise. The solution? Boiling the linen, or, if desperate, simply burning it and starting fresh. New clothes, new start, a motto many peasants lived by. Now let us turn to dandruff, or as medieval folk charmingly called it, dry scalp snow. While not life-threatening, dandruff was aesthetically unwelcome, especially in courtly circles, where a flurry of white flakes on one's velvet mantle could quickly become the talk of the feast. Remedies abounded, rinsing the scalp with vinegar, rubbing in herbal oils or applying powdered sage. Did these work? Occasionally. Did they smell odd? Absolutely. But in a world where personal scent was already a complex issue, one more herbal note was neither here nor there. Some more extreme remedies included rubbing the scalp with onion juice or salt paste. Treatments that might cure the dandruff, but at the cost of social invitations. Imagine leaning in for a courtly whisper, only to have your companion recoil and mutter something about the salad dressing of St. Benedict. And of course, there were superstitions. Many believed that lice were a form of divine punishment, a consequence of sin or impure thoughts. Others saw them as holy companions, reminders of one's earthly mortality. Certain saints were even praised for refusing to comb their hair, seeing lice as fellow creatures of God. Charitable to lice, less so to their fellow monks. In reality, Lice and dandruff were simply unbeatable foes. You could comb, shave, boil, pray, and still wake up scratching, and everyone knew it. Entire social interactions were built around itching etiquette. Scratching in public was frowned upon, but discreet scratching beneath the table or during long sermons was an art form. And so, life went on. One scratch at a time. Lice were picked, dandruff was dusted, linen was boiled, and combs were passed down through generations. It was not glamorous, but it was honest medieval hygiene, a constant battle against six-legged insurgents and flaky defeat. So the next time you complain about a bad hair day, remember your medieval cousins, seated by the hearth, enduring the slow, methodical nitpicking of Aunt Matilda, dreaming of a world where the only flakes they had to worry about were falling from the sky. Now, no matter how much lavender you stuffed into your sleeves, how often you changed your linen, or how enthusiastically you scrubbed your teeth with salt, there was one inescapable truth of medieval life. Everyone had to go. And let us be perfectly clear, medieval toilets were an adventure. Not a pleasant one, but an adventure nonetheless. For the privileged few, nobles, high clergy, castle dwellers, there existed the architectural marvel known as the garderobe. A garderobe was essentially a stone closet with a hole in a wooden or stone bench, often built into the outer wall of the castle, cantilevered over a pit, moat, or open-air drop. The results of your digestive efforts would plummet, sometimes several stories, into whatever unfortunate space lay below. A cesspit, a stream, or, on very bad days, the castle courtyard. One can only imagine the conversations among castle gardeners. To use the garderobe was a chilly, echoing experience. Imagine sitting with your backside exposed to a stone shaft, winter wind whistling upwards, while eyeing the stonework for spiders the size of plums. There were no toilet seats, no padded comfort, and certainly no reading material, unless you count the Bible verses carved by previous occupants in moments of reflective desperation. And lest you think this was merely a functional space, no, guardrobes were also used to store clothing. Why? Because the ammonia fumes from the pit below were believed to deter moths. Yes, truly. Darling, have you seen my velvet doublet? Oh yes, it's hanging in the toilet. A medieval 2-for-1, pest control and personal relief. But of course, the vast majority of the population did not have access to such architectural wonders. For peasants, townsfolk, and even many merchants, the toilet was wherever you could find a bit of privacy, or failing that, a dark corner and a quick prayer for forgiveness. In rural areas, most peasants used latrine pits, simple holes dug in the earth, sometimes with a wooden seat but more often surrounded by reeds or a makeshift fence. These pits were emptied rarely, and the smell, well, let's just say local dogs gave them a wide berth. In some villages, communal latrines existed, but sharing a toilet with 12 of your neighbours after a bean-heavy feast was no one's idea of comfort. In towns, the situation was more creative and considerably more hazardous. Chamber pots were the standard, ceramic or metal pots kept under the bed or in the corner of the room. These were used at night or during inclement weather, and then, here comes the fun part, emptied into the street. Yes, really. With a cheerful cry of "Gardez l'eau," watch out for the water, citizens would toss the contents out of their upper-story windows, leaving passers-by below to dodge or regret their life choices. Urban streets were therefore a treacherous obstacle course, especially in narrow alleys where gravity and human biology conspired to turn every stroll into an olfactory gauntlet. City officials occasionally tried to regulate this practice, designating certain hours or requiring waste to be dumped into central gutters, but enforcement was, let's say, inconsistent. After all, what constable wanted to patrol a street where the sky itself could turn against him at any moment? And as for toilet paper, well, such luxuries were unheard of. The options were many, but none pleasant. Moss, straw, handfuls of hay, scraps of linen, if you were wealthy, or simply your hand, followed by a vigorous rinse, ideally in a stream not upstream of the local fishery. In winter, the truly brave might use snow, which was at least cleansing, if not for the faint of heart. And thus the medieval toilet experience was a study in creative resilience. People adapted. They endured. They learned to walk in the middle of the street, to avoid window-based assaults, to watch where they stepped, and to carry a sprig of rosemary or a pomander for moral support. So the next time you flush your modern toilet with its ceramic throne and cherry-scented air freshener, take a moment to appreciate the journey, from stone guardrobe to latrine pit to chamber pot surprise attack, that human sanitation has travelled. And remember, had you lived in medieval Europe, your daily mantra would not have been cleanliness is next to godliness, but rather, keep your mouth closed when walking under balconies. Now, having discussed the medieval toilet experience in all, its stone-walled, chamber-potted glory, one cannot ignore the most charming postscript to every nocturnal visit, the noble art of chamber pot disposal. Yes, my friend, for every chamber pot filled there came a fateful moment when it had to be emptied, and oh, what a medieval spectacle that was. Let's set the scene. You're an average medieval citizen. It is the middle of the night. You have successfully used your chamber pot, a humble ceramic vessel that now contains a heady blend of whatever medieval digestion has offered. It is too dark, too cold, or too dangerous, depending on your neighbourhood, to venture to the public latrine. So what do? Why, you place the pot carefully by the side of the bed and go back to sleep, of course. The real fun comes in the morning, because someone must now deal with the contents, and unless you are nobility with servants, that someone is you. If you were fortunate enough to live in a wealthy household, this delightful task fell to a scullery maid, an underservant, or an unlucky apprentice. The chosen soul would gather chamber pots from every room, balancing them on a wooden tray or iron hook, and gingerly descend the stairs, trying not to spill a drop. The risk of disaster was high. More than one medieval diary records tales of the girl who slipped upon the stair, resulting in both physical injury and an olfactory catastrophe that lingered for weeks. But for most of the population, artisans, peasants, minor merchants, it was a do-it-yourself affair. After breakfast, or occasionally before if the pot had reached critical mass, you would carry it to an upper window or street-facing balcony. And here came one of the most theatrical moments of the day, the ceremonial shout of warning. In France, the cry was "Gardez l'eau," literally watch out for the water. In England, something similar, look out below, or where va, in Italy. A cheerful aqua va. The idea was simple. You gave fair warning to passers-by so they might dive for cover. In practice, of course, the warnings were often mumbled, shouted half a second too late, or ignored entirely after a heavy drinking night. Many a medieval pedestrian learned to walk the streets with eyes up and cloak drawn tightly overhead, not for fashion, but for self-preservation. And then, the pour. With a practised hand, the pot's contents would be hurled into the street, where they joined horse manure, fish guts, kitchen slop, and all the other delights of medieval urban life. Some streets had central gutters or stone channels to carry waste away, in theory. In reality, the gutters often became clogged rivers of misery, especially after rain. Medieval city streets were a sensory experience, and not one you wish to undertake on an empty stomach. Of course, not everyone lived in a house with an upper window. Those on ground floors would carry their pot out to the nearest corner or alley and perform the ritual there. It was considered polite, or at least less antisocial, to dump your waste in designated spots. But in crowded cities, every shadowed nook became a potential target. Some towns attempted to regulate the practice. Laws were passed forbidding pot dumping during certain hours, say during Mass, or while the market was open. Fines were imposed for hitting pedestrians, though proving the culprit was often tricky, unless the offended party arrived dripping and furious on the magistrate's doorstep. It came from the third window on the left, your worship, was a common but rarely conclusive accusation. Naturally, the upper classes tried to distance themselves from this sordid business. Castles and manors often had waste chutes or guardrobe shafts. Wealthy townhouses hired night soil men, professionals who collected chamber pots door to door and carted the contents to designated dumps outside the city. It was not a glamorous job, but it paid, and one could always console oneself with the thought that at least you were being paid to handle filth, unlike the countless household servants who did it for free. And so the cycle continued. Day after day, night after night, chamber pots were filled, dumped, cleaned with cold water and a quick prayer, and returned to their humble station beneath the bed. It was not elegant, it was not sanitary, but it was medieval life, where the difference between a good day and a bad one might be whether you managed to empty your pot without redecorating your neighbour's boots. So the next time you flush your toilet, bid a silent thank you to the centuries of chamber pot bearers who came before you. Those brave souls who faced each morning with a pot in hand, an apologetic smile, and the eternal hope that today, just today, no one would be walking directly beneath their window. Now, after the daily ritual of chamber pot dumping, you might wonder, who exactly was responsible for cleaning the medieval streets? The short answer: everyone and no one. Which is precisely why medieval cities often smelled like a barnyard having an existential crisis. In theory, town councils and local guilds passed regulations about street cleanliness. Edicts were issued. Fines were promised. All citizens shall sweep the space before their dwellings each morning, proclaimed the statutes of more than one ambitious mayor. In practice, however, the gap between law and reality was as wide as the stench drifting through the market square. For one thing, medieval streets weren't designed for cleanliness. They were often narrow, uneven, unpaved, and deeply crowned, meaning that all the refuse naturally flowed to the centre, creating a lovely channel of filth known as the kennel or runlet. After a good rain, this channel became a torrent of unimaginable horror, sweeping away everything from rotting produce to dead rats, and depositing it, with perverse efficiency, into the nearest public square or fishmonger's stall. And what exactly filled these streets? Oh, the list was long and colourful. Aside from the aforementioned chamber pot offerings, there was horse manure, plentiful as horses were the medieval version of Uber, offal from butchers, ashes from hearths, broken crockery, fish heads, vegetable peelings, human hair from barbers, soiled rushes from tavern floors, and the occasional entire animal carcass, because sometimes it was easier to roll your dead goat into the gutter than drag it to the tanner's yard. So who swept this fragrant cocktail of medieval life? In wealthier towns there were paid street sweepers, usually hired by the city guilds or church authorities. These men, often the lowest of the low in terms of social status, trudged through the streets with brooms of birch or heather, pushing the sludge toward designated collection points. From there it might be carted away to fields outside the walls, or simply heaped higher and left to fester. But let's be realistic. Such sweepers were few, and city funds were limited. The bulk of street cleaning was expected to be done by residents themselves. Each householder was supposed to keep the area directly in front of their property reasonably passable. The definition of reasonably passable varied wildly, depending on the owner's standards and whether they'd had a heavy drinking night. For many, this meant simply shoving the worst of the muck toward their neighbour's threshold. Medieval sanitation was very much a not-in-front-of-my-door affair. Market days were particularly festive. By mid-morning, the streets would be ankle-deep in discarded cabbage leaves, fish scales, chicken feathers, and a generous layer of muddy footprints. Add a few runaway pigs and a tipsy minstrel relieving himself in a corner, and you had the full sensory experience of medieval commerce. Clean up, perhaps a cursory sweep, or perhaps wait until the next rainstorm and let nature take its course. Efficient and eco-friendly, if not exactly pleasant. Festivals and holy days brought brief bursts of cleanliness. Before major processions, say for Corpus Christi or the arrival of royal visitors, towns would organise a general cleaning. Streets were swept, rushes were laid down, and flowers were scattered to mask the underlying odour. For one glorious day the city might almost smell bearable, until the first horse passed through and reset the olfactory balance. Winter posed its own challenges. Snow would fall, covering everything in a deceptive white purity. Beneath the surface, however, the refuse remained. and as the snow melted it revealed a fermented sludge of epic proportions. Many chroniclers describe the spring thaw as a season of nausea and civic despair. And finally, let us not forget the role of animals in medieval street cleaning. Dogs, pigs, rats and crows all played their part, picking over refuse and helping to process the city's waste. It was a symbiotic relationship. Humans produced the filth and animals tidied it. Sort of. Of course, this came with its own set of problems. Rabies, fleas, vermin infestations. But in a world without municipal sanitation departments, one made do. So the next time you stroll down a sparkling, freshly swept boulevard, spare a thought for the medieval citizen navigating ankle-deep refuse, eyes peeled for falling chamber pot surprises, and armed only with a birch broom and a sturdy sense of humour. They walked so we could saunter unsoiled. Now, after all we've said about the medieval fear of bathing, you may be wondering, were there any public baths that survived the tide of superstition, sin, and bubonic plague? The answer is yes, though not many, and not without a hefty side serving of scandal. You see, in early medieval Europe, public baths were not only common, they were celebrated. Bathhouses, or stews, as they were often called, which should already tell you something about the water quality, offered everything from hot tubs and steam rooms to massages, and, in certain more liberal establishments, companionship of a distinctly non-hygienic nature. In cities like Paris, London, Cologne and Venice, bathhouses remained part of urban life well into the 14th and 15th centuries. You could find them tucked into market districts, attached to monasteries, or openly advertised with cheerful wooden signs depicting naked figures reclining in tubs, just in case the locals weren't sure what was on offer. Of course, not all baths were created equal. At the high end there were respectable bathhouses, places where one could, in theory, simply get clean. Here, you would rent a private or semi-private tub, filled with hot water, heated laboriously over wood-fired stoves, and perfumed with herbs such as rosemary, sage, lavender, or thyme. Attendants would provide soap, towels, and drinks. You might even hear musicians playing in the background. It all sounds almost civilized, and for a fleeting moment it was. Then there were the other bathhouses, the ones that tiptoed, then sprinted over the line of respectability. Mixed-gender bathing was common in many regions, particularly in Germany, Italy, and the Low Countries. Bathers would lounge in the water together, drinking ale or spiced wine, nibbling on roasted meats, and engaging in what can only be described as vigorous networking. It wasn't long before the bathhouse became synonymous with vice, to the great distress of the clergy, who preached fiery sermons about the perils of wet skin and temptation. And then came the Black Death. With the arrival of plague, public bathing acquired an entirely new level of paranoia. It was believed that hot water opened the pores, allowing bad air, or miasma, to seep into the body. Suddenly the very act of bathing went from healthful to suicidal. Bathhouses closed by the dozens. Some were repurposed into bakeries, granaries, or simply left to rot. Damp, echoing relics of a more optimistic age. Yet, in certain corners of Europe, bathhouses clung to life. In southern Europe, where Roman bathing culture never fully vanished, the tradition survived longest. Cities like Florence, Seville, and Constantinople boasted bathhouses well into the Renaissance, often with architectural grandeur that put northern stews to shame. There, one could still enjoy a proper steam bath, followed by a vigorous scrub and a relaxing session in a herbal pool, though even these baths remained haunted by whispers of moral decay. In more pragmatic towns, bathhouses adapted. To counteract fears of disease, many began to offer dry baths, essentially steam rooms or sweat baths where no full immersion occurred. These allowed patrons to cleanse via perspiration, which was considered safer and helpfully aligned with the belief that sweating expelled illness. And for the truly determined, the nobility, private baths became the answer. Wealthy households constructed bathing chambers with portable tubs, often lined with linen and filled with boiled water and herbs. Servants hauled endless buckets from the kitchen fires, and the resulting bath was enjoyed in relative privacy, far from the moral hazards of public stews. Of course, this also meant that only the wealthy could afford to bathe regularly, a state of affairs that many peasants accepted with grim resignation. By the 16th century, the public bathhouse was largely a memory in much of northern Europe, vilified by the church, abandoned by the fearful, and overtaken by rising concerns about propriety and sin. But in the south and in Eastern Europe they persisted, and even in England, where baths had fallen from grace, one could still find secret stews operating in the shadows, equal parts bath and brothel, patronised by those willing to risk both scandal and infection for the chance to soak in warm water. And so the public bath became a half-forgotten relic, a symbol of an age when communal cleansing was considered both pleasurable and practical. Today, we might lounge in a spa or enjoy a bubble bath, but our medieval ancestors viewed the simple act of getting clean as an enterprise fraught with danger, temptation, and the occasional arrest warrant. So the next time you sink into your modern bathtub, remember those few brave souls who, in the face of superstition, scandal, and soap shortages, still chose to strip down, step in, and declare, "Cleanliness may be next to godliness, but it's also a lot of fun." Now, after wading through the grime of medieval streets, dodging flying chamber pots, and possibly surviving a trip to the local respectable bathhouse, one might well ask, when our medieval friends did attempt to scrub themselves, clean, what did they use? The answer, dear listener, is soap, though not the dainty perfumed bars you find in modern boutiques. No, medieval soap was an entirely different beast. First and foremost, let's be clear, soap making was an art, and not always a pleasant-smelling one. The basic recipe was simple in theory, terrifying in practice. You took animal fat from sheep, pigs, or cattle, rendered it down into a slick, viscous mass, and mixed it with alkaline substances. And where did these alkalis come from? Well, from wood ash, or, in particularly desperate households, from aged urine. Yes, you heard correctly. Soap making was very much an olfactory adventure from start to finish. Here's your classic medieval soap recipe. Step 1. Collect wood ash from your hearth. The best ash came from hardwoods, which produced a stronger lye solution. You would soak this ash in water for several days, stirring occasionally, until you had a potent caustic liquid known as lye water. How potent? Let's just say that if it dissolved your wooden stirring stick, it was ready. Step 2. Render the fat. This involved boiling hunks of animal fat in a large cauldron until all impurities were skimmed away and you were left with clear, bubbling tallow. The smell? Imagine a mixture of old stew, wet dog, and burnt hair wafting through your entire household. A true delight. Step 3. Combine the lye and fat. Slowly, cautiously, lest the mixture bubble over and strip the skin from your hands. You would stir and simmer this concoction for hours, sometimes adding salt to help the soap harden, sometimes adding herbs or flowers to mask the stench. Common additions included rosemary, lavender, marjoram, and sage, though no amount of herbs could fully disguise the underlying aroma of boiled sheep fat and caustic soda. Step 4. Pour the mixture into moulds, usually simple wooden boxes, and let it harden for several days or weeks. The resulting soap was cut into rough blocks. No charming pastel colours or carved roses here, just chunky, waxy slabs that resembled old cheese and smelled faintly of burned barnyard. And that, my friend, was your standard household soap, suitable for laundry, scrubbing floors, and if one was feeling particularly brave, washing the body. But be warned, this soap was harsh. Using it on delicate skin often resulted in dryness, redness, and the sensation of having been lightly sandpapered by St. Anthony himself. For those with coin to spare, there were gentler alternatives. Castile soap, imported from Spain and the Islamic world, was highly prized. Made from olive oil instead of animal fat, and without the more noxious ingredients of northern recipes, Castile soap was milder, smoother, and smelled almost pleasant. It was, however, expensive, and thus reserved for the wealthy elite. The sort of people who could afford to bathe with imported soap while their peasants scrubbed themselves raw with pig-fat bricks. In some regions, particularly in Italy and the Middle East, soap making was a highly respected trade, with professional soap makers producing refined products for the nobility. Their recipes were closely guarded secrets, handed down through guilds and families, and involved precise measurements, careful timing, and the use of exotic fragrances like ambergris, musk, or rose oil. But for the average medieval household, soap making was a once or twice a year event, a communal, smelly, occasionally dangerous process undertaken with grim determination. Families would set aside a week for it, gathering ash, fat and herbs, heating enormous cauldrons over open fires, and hoping that this year's batch wouldn't burn the eyebrows off the apprentice. And so it was that medieval people washed, when they did wash, with rough, lie-heavy blocks, their skin tingling or screaming afterward, and the air filled with the heady perfume of goat fat and sage. It was not glamorous, it was not luxurious, but it was clean by medieval standards, and that was triumph enough. So the next time you pick up a bar of honey vanilla shea butter soap, give a moment of gratitude to the brave souls who came before you, those who stirred cauldrons of bubbling fat, risked lye burns, and endured the endless mockery of neighbours who swore they could smell the soap factory from 3 streets away. They scrubbed so that you might one day bathe in blissful ignorance. And now we come to the unsung, back-breaking cornerstone of medieval hygiene, laundry. Because for all that medieval folk might have avoided bathing, they were surprisingly diligent about washing their linen, their one true defence against the endless assault of sweat, lice, fleas and public shame. You see, in a world where bathing the body was viewed with a mixture of suspicion and terror, it was far safer and more respectable to simply wash your clothes, especially the layers worn closest to the skin. Thus, the humble linen shift, chemise or shirt became the front line of medieval hygiene. Clean shirt, clean conscience, or at least less visible grime. But here's the thing. Washing linen was not a simple matter of tossing it into a machine, pressing a few buttons and going off for a cup of tea. Oh no, laundry day, more accurately laundry week, was a logistical, physical and often olfactorily traumatic event. Let us begin with the basics. First, you had to collect enough dirty linen to make the ordeal worthwhile, which usually meant several weeks' worth of shifts, underclothes, bed linens, towels, and occasionally baby wrappings or bandages. By this point, the laundry was not merely soiled, it was sentient. The stench alone could knock out small rodents, but fear not. The medieval washerwomen were made of sterner stuff. Next came the soaking. Linen was steeped in a solution of lye. Yes, that same delightful caustic brew made from wood ash. And for the truly dedicated, there was another option. Aged urine, also known as chamber lye. You see, urine contains ammonia, an excellent natural degreaser. Many medieval households kept special pots to collect wash water, and the more ripened it was, the better. Modern dry cleaners could only dream of such dedication. Soaked in this potent blend of chemistry and courage, the linen was then hauled to the nearest stream or river. This is where the real spectacle began. Along the banks, entire communities of washerwomen would gather, armed with wooden paddles, soap blocks and iron muscles. The linen was slapped, pounded, scrubbed against washing stones, and wrung out with enough force to flatten a stubborn duke's ego. The noise alone was legendary. The river sings, as one medieval poet politely put it. Of course, this process came with risks. Rivers were public spaces, shared with livestock, fishmongers, and the occasional dead body. One had to be vigilant, not just for the sake of cleanliness, but also to avoid being swept downstream by an over-enthusiastic current. More than one unfortunate apprentice was known to have gone for a wash and stayed there. After thorough rinsing, often in freezing water, because laundry was a year-round ordeal, the linen was wrung out and spread to dry. Fields, hedgerows, fences, castle courtyards, anywhere there was sunlight and breeze. And here too came hazards. Birds with no respect for hygiene, stray dogs with a fondness for linen, and jealous neighbours who might just borrow your finer garments while you were off chasing a runaway chicken. And let us not forget the social element. Laundry day was a time of gossip, matchmaking, and the airing of far more than just linens. Every spot and stain told a story. Did you see Lady Marjorie's shift? I hear she's been visiting Sir Thomas rather late these nights. A well-washed chemise could elevate your standing in the community. A stained or poorly laundered one, social death. Finally, after drying, the linen was brought home and, if you were truly ambitious, pressed. This was done with heavy stones, wooden rollers, or primitive smoothing irons filled with hot coals. The goal was not only to remove wrinkles, but also to crush any lingering vermin. Because remember, lice loved linen, and if your underclothes were not properly boiled and pressed, you might as well invite them back for supper. And so it was that medieval people maintained their peculiar balance of cleanliness. Bodies left largely to their own devices, but linen washed with a fervour bordering on the religious. A crisp, fresh shift was a badge of honour, a sign that you were civilised, virtuous, and less likely to clear a room when you entered. So the next time you toss a load of laundry into your gleaming modern machine, spare a thought for those who came before, who faced freezing rivers, caustic lie, feral geese, and the ever-watchful eyes of gossiping neighbours, all in pursuit of the elusive dream, one clean shirt to face the filthy medieval world.